Good morning. My name is Andrew Bailey, and I'm one of the Emerging Technologies Fellow here at SAIS, and I have the distinct honor to introduce the panel, Fueling the Technology of the Future. This panel will explore the AI triad, data, compute, and algorithms, and the foundational technologies that make AI possible. From the energy demands of AI-driven data centers to the semiconductor supply chains powering computation, panelists will discuss the critical investments and innovations needed to sustain AI's growth and some of the challenges it faces. But what makes this panel unique is the exceptional qualifications of our panelists, starting with today's moderator, Dr. Melissa Griffith. She is a lecturer in technology and national security here at SAIS, as well as an affiliated faculty with the Alperovich Institute and a senior advisor to the Emerging Technologies Initiative. From cybersecurity to tech security, Melissa works at the intersection between technology, national security, and economic statecraft with a specialization in cybersecurity, semiconductors, and machine learning artificial intelligence. Next to her right is Benjamin Della Rocca. Ben served as Director for Technology and National Security at the National Security Council, and prior to that at the National Economic Council, making 2.5 years in the White House. At the NSC, Ben led the White House's work on AI data centers and energy needs, including authorship of the January 2025 Executive Order on AI Infrastructure. He was also a key drafter of the 2023 AI Executive Order. Ben is an adjunct fellow at the RAND Corporation, and he has previously worked at the Council on Foreign Relations and the Bridgewater Associates. He holds a JD and BA from Yale, and he has published in outlets including Foreign Affairs, The Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. I wanted to flag one of our guests that was unable to make it today, Dr. Mark Dredze. He unfortunately had a family matter this morning to tend to, but he is a professor of computer science from the JHU Whiting School of Engineering, just adding the fact that we have collaborated with other JHU universities. To Ben's right is Eric Breckenfeld. Eric Breckenfeld serves on NVIDIA's government affairs team as Director of Technology Policy, where he leads on policy related to semiconductor supply chains and artificial intelligence. Prior to this, Eric held a role at the Semiconductor Industry Association, where he assisted with the passage and early implementation of the 2022 CHIPS and Science Act. Previously, Eric served as a subject matter expert at DARPA with an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow for the White House's National Nanotechnology Initiative, and was a National Research Council Fellow at the Naval Research Laboratory. He received his Bachelor of Science in Physics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his PhD in Material Science and Engineering from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And finally, to his right, we have Benjamin Schwartz. Benjamin Schwartz has 20 plus years of experience at the intersection of public policy and technology, having served in executive positions in government, industry, and the nonprofit sector. He currently is the managing head of infrastructure partnerships and policy at OpenAI. Ben entered government service at the Central Intelligence Agency, then joined the Federal Civil Service after completing his MA in International Relations and Economics at SAIS. He subsequently served in a range of positions within the U.S. national security community, including at the Department of State, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and Department of Commerce. He most recently served as the Director of National Security in the CHIPS Program Office. Thank you all for being here today. With that, I'm excited to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Melissa Griffith, who will guide us through what's sure to be a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is this on? Maybe? Yep. Thank you so much. So thank you so much to the Emerging Technologies Initiative, to Johns Hopkins SAIS, and all of the various people. There's a literal army that sit behind every panel and every podcast that you see today. So thank you to everyone who made this possible. We have the privilege of we're the first panel of the day following a podcast. There was a tour de force that covered everything from chips infrastructure to national security concerns to China to DeepSeek. And we're going to sort of try to take you down into the weeds a little bit on this question of artificial intelligence. What do you need in terms of computing power, in terms of the data you need access to, the algorithms and the models themselves, the infrastructure, data centers, to the energy infrastructure that's powering those data centers? What do we need to be able to capitalize on the promise of the current innovation moment, but also on the deployment and adoption of AI applications much more broadly? As you can see by the kind of incredible biographies of everyone I'm joined on stage with here today, this is a very multi-stakeholder problem. It is interdisciplinary by nature, and it spans a variety of industry stakeholders, academic stakeholders, research, think tanks, government across the board into DoD and beyond. So we're very excited to have that range of experience before us. The question I want to start us off with, bending in and really leaning into each of your areas of expertise, is to ask us to reflect on the last 10 years and the next 10 years. So if we look at the last 10 years of artificial intelligence, big step change, logarithmic jumps in terms of the capacity and capability of these systems, the kind of revenue, the hype around some of the national security and realized concerns in that space to geopolitical interventions, all the way down the stack. But there's also a lot of policy tension on sort of trying to address what we think the future of AI might look like. And sometimes we do that by indexing on the previous 10 years. So I'd actually like to kind of swing down the line and ask each of you from where you sit, whether that's the chips in the semiconductor space or the infrastructure space or the application and infrastructure space, does the last 10 years of AI look like the next 10 years of AI? What are the through lines that you think you might see there? And I'll start with you, Ben.
Yeah, happy to. Oh, this is very loud.
We bring the heat.
Happy to take that first and hold the microphone at a safe distance from my face. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the next 5-10 years will hold, but I guess I'll start with what we do know, which is that if you look back at the last 10 years, right, what we've seen is there's been a fairly predictable and exponential increase in the amount of computing power that is used to train AI models that are at the frontier or at the state of the art. And we've seen along with this, as training compute has increased, we've also seen a relatively predictable increase in capabilities of AI models, at least as measured by many benchmarks. So if anything like this paradigm of scaling continues in the near future, what that implies is the amount of computing power that will be needed and energy that will be needed to train some of the most powerful AI models, 2 to 3 years from now, will be somewhere on the order of 3 to 5 gigawatts of scale. If you look at the computing power, it's been roughly a 4 to 5x increase annually, and then factoring in some of the energy efficiency increases that you would see on the hardware side, that would factor into also a comparably fast rate of annual increase in energy needs as well. So this is consistent with what many of the leading companies have said publicly or shared about their training plans and expenditures. And what it means is ultimately this adds up to a really large amount of energy that will be needed to power some of the most powerful AI systems. For comparison, the US electric grid as a whole has 1,300 gigawatts of capacity, right? New York City, in its peak periods of electricity demand in the summer months when everyone is using the air conditioning, et cetera, is roughly 10 or 11 gigawatts of power demand. So that's just twice what some of these frontier AI training runs might require if the current trends roughly continue in terms of their energy demand. So will the next 10 years look like the last 10 years? If, in some sense, yes, if we see continued returns to scaling, right? We'll see a continued exponential increase in growth. But what that means in terms of absolute energy demand looks very different, right? When you get to really, really high magnitudes of gigawatts. Now, I've just spoken about the training side, right? There's also inference to consider, as well as training operations that happen below the frontier and fine-tuning and that sort of, those sorts of activities. And inference, I think in particular, is somewhere where we're liable to see a very different, state of affairs in the next 5 years, given a lot of the changes that we're seeing in the broader economy and how AI is deployed. So first of all, as AI is deployed more widely, as companies figure out how to use AI productively across different systems and business processes, that's going to rapidly increase the total amount of compute and therefore energy use that is required for AI inference. And meeting this need will require, given the latency sensitivity of many AI applications, will require a broad-based network, most likely, of data centers that can power AI. And then also some of the recent developments that we've seen in terms of capability gains from reasoning models and advances there also increase the amount of computational power and the returns from using more computational power at the inference stage. So all these things will factor into much more, I would expect, energy needs from the inference side going forward. This is really at odds with how I think many in the power sector or the energy sector have really thought about increases in load growth in recent years, where for the past 10, 20 years, energy demand growth has been relatively flat and stagnant in the United States more broadly for a variety of reasons. And data center power needs have not grown at an exponential pace. They've grown at a very linear pace. So this is a real step change in many ways from what we've seen, but I think is what we can expect in many ways going forward.
Fantastic. So the shift that we've seen over time between just thinking about the training side to inference and the very different compute loads for both of those and compute architectures for both of those, as well as just the sheer rise of deployment and adoption driving a lot of that demand side. on that piece. I'd like to pivot to you, Eric, here to talk a little bit about the chips ecosystem, and I'm going to define that quite broadly from the semiconductors themselves in the last 10 years, which there's been a lot of growth and sort of evolution, not just from your perch at NVIDIA, but much more broadly, to where those semiconductors sit. So we've heard Ben talk a little bit about data centers, but you also have the applications at the edge, so sitting in phones or Internet of Things devices or satellites that are a little bit further removed. Do we think that we're sort of seeing the next 10 years in your space, in the compute space, looking awfully like the previous 10?
You know, I think that there are ways in which the future will resemble some of these scaling trends that we've already seen over the past, I don't know, 10 years, or even, let's say, beginning of the smartphone revolution, whenever we want to say that was, 2006 or something. So, you know, I have in my mind, if I'm a member of the technology-informed public, I have in my mind an idea that the single chip is the heart of what's driving everything forward. And as the chip gets better, you know, that's how all these systems get smarter, and that's how I drive down energy use, or I make it more efficient and then use it way more, so I actually drive up energy use. But anyways, on a per chip basis, I drive down energy use. And so, you know, that's very it's a familiar way to think about things, because I have a personal device at home, my laptop or my desktop computer, or I have a personal device in my pocket. And as the hardware that underpins the function of that device gets better, my device gets smarter, and it can, you know, last longer on battery life and all these sorts of things. And so, you know, this is a paradigm of computing that actually wasn't the case for all of the history of computing, because computers, of course, used to be the size of buildings. And we've now gone back to that case where a lot of the computers that run a lot of the functions that folks are interacting with, if they're interacting with token generation from large language models, is in computers that are the size of buildings. So, you know, that's going to continue, but the ways in which those systems of hardware become higher performing go beyond just the performance of the chips themselves. So yes, that's important, but now I'm depending on a system that is thousands, tens of thousands. If I'm looking at Elon Musk's installation in Tennessee, hundreds of thousands of chips all interlinked together. And the bottlenecks of performance may no longer come from the chips themselves, but from the networking technologies. Or, you know, you start to hear from Microsoft or other providers that they're actually thinking about, because of energy-related constraints, how you link up multiple data centers together to achieve greater functionality. And so, yes, the core chip at the heart of that, you know, for us that means the GPU die, the heart of performance, is very important, but you quickly start to run into bottlenecks that come from the networking stages, that come from synchronization and cooperation of these chips in tandem in a very, very large setup. That's fundamentally different from how these things have functioned before, and they require efficiency improvements, not just in a Moore's law sense, not just in how much power do I possibly get into your pocket, but how do I link these things together? How do I drive down system level energy use? That's on really the training and large scale data center operation side. Maybe we can get into this a little bit more in the talk, because I've probably almost bumped up against my time here, but I do want to touch on the one comment earlier of inference. Inference may be a little bit of a fork off of this, because the needs of inference will be unique. The needs of training, of large-scale pre-training, are similar to each other in the sense that they all take very large data sets and an enormous amount of compute power, and then they compress those data sets down into a model. But inference, it could be multi-user inference served out of a data center, much more like a conventional data center today serves like web traffic. It could be something like that. Or it could be your personal inference, a personal device that lives in your pocket or lives in your home that holds some much smaller model that does inference on the edge. It could be robotics or automation. These are all going to have very different needs and will have different hardware demands. And so we're still just at the beginning inflection point of that. So, you know, I suppose my conclusion to my however long I've taken here, 5 minutes, is, you know, things are going to look like they have looked before, but also we're at the very beginning of an inflection point, and it is hard to take trends now and just linearly drag them forward into the future. So there are going to be unpredictable demands in the hardware that going to have to flexibly address. And we can never ignore energy. That will be a ceiling that we will bump into very, very soon.
Will that energy be one of the main drivers of cost in this space? The rise of inference, which I think we're seeing as a trend line. So for those of you that are sort of keeping score, you can check that off on your bingo cards, the rise of inference in this space. But also you talked a little bit about networking effects. Could you give a tangible example for those that maybe are having a little bit of hard time understanding or kind of conceptualizing that from, okay, I've got chips and I've got data centers that are made up of servers and racks. And what's an example of networking that you're working on?
Yeah, so there's a couple of great graphical, quasi animations, slide build-outs, I guess you would call them, in our CEO, Jensen Huang's most recent keynote talks at our annual conferences. So we just had, GTC is what it's called. So we just had one in March, and then obviously the March before that. And he does two great product unveilings. Last year was the Blackwell stack for the Blackwell chip. And he shows how a single chip gets packaged into a 8 GPU, 2 CPU server blade, and how that then goes into a rack, and there's 72 GPUs in a rack, and then how those racks go into pods, and then how those pods build out a data center. And the image that he has in this keynote is I think a 30,000 GPU data center. At the time that slide deck was built, we thought that was a large data center. So anyways, maybe there's an update that's needed to that. But the point is that as you look at how this build out happens and each of the stages that integrate larger and larger sets of GPUs together, there are pauses in the scale up where we say, oh, and by the way, this is where a networking chip gets put into place. And the networking chips serve a variety of functions, but the simplest way to think about it is the networking chips are what allow 72 or 32,000 GPUs to link up to each other and to function in a way where you don't get rapid diminishing returns. What tends to happen when you link up very large numbers of chips together is you start to get what we call like a root N relationship, where more and more chips get added, but you start to hit diminishing returns, and then you can keep adding more and more chips, but you just don't get very much out of it. You want to get away from that paradigm, but that requires, in the same way that a GPU is a chip specialized to do graphics or AI, you need a chip specialized to do the networking, to manage the traffic, and to make sure all your resources are getting deployed efficiently. Because the last thing I want is to have a big training workload and half my chips are idling because they've already finished their tasks and the rest of my chips are still going. That's the last circumstance that I want. And so the networking chips assist with that.
So the diversity of chips, networking, inference, the importance of infrastructure, and the energy underpinning. Finishing us out on this opening round of comments, Ben, from the kind of viewpoint of application and sort of innovators on models and algorithms and leveraging that data, what's your viewpoint on the last 10 years into the next 10 years? What should we be tracking?
So your question, as I sit here at SAIS, it reminds me of a warning that a professor of mine made when I was a student here, which is it's much better to predict the past than to attempt to predict the future. So I'm going to try to stick with that advice. By the way, when I was here, we had a much smaller building with a much smaller room, and there's clean windows and the floor looks clean. So just appreciate that. Yeah. So there's some things that we do know at this point with substantial confidence, and one of them is that leadership in AI technology is a function of a fixed number of factors, and the scaling laws are fairly clear: access to data, access to energy, and access to chips. And whoever sort of has the greatest access to these things at scale is going to be in a position to sort of win the competition for AI leadership. And in this respect, infrastructure is destiny. That's sort of the saying that we tell ourselves at OpenAI about what we need to maintain leadership in this area. And so if we sort of say, what is the future going to look like? What companies are going to maintain leadership or become leaders in this area? We're thinking a lot about that infrastructure requirement. The future, is unpredictable. We have over 500 million weekly active users at this point. I don't know how many people would have predicted that a year ago. We're dealing with the geopolitics of the moment that seems to shift, hour by hour, and one of the things that we focus on is like, how do we build at scale, large things, large infrastructure at scale, for all the reasons that's been articulated already. The companies and the countries that create an attractive environment for those kind of build projects are going to win this race. Because the things that have been discussed, the GPUs and the energy, cost a tremendous amount of money. And so how do you attract capital flows? You know, there's a role of government for sure, but ultimately much of that funding is private capital. And so you need to convince the owners of that capital that they're going to find a return profile on that investment. They could, you know, commit that money to build in, I don't know, Illinois or Indiana or New Mexico, and you know, there's a good chance that that building project is going to occur on schedule. It's going to be filled with GPUs that, you know, are a reasonable price. You could work on that, and you know, you're going to have the user demands that justify those investments, and people are going to pay for that service, and et cetera. And you know, this technology is world transforming, right? Like, I'm sure you guys have heard anecdotes from your friends about the use of this technology, but companies are shifting their business plans and their hiring and their productivity projections and things of that nature. And you know, what we want to do as a company is we want to make sure that this technology is available to as many people as possible. And that ultimately means that it has to be, you know, the price of this technology has to be low enough that people can, you know, afford to pay for it. And that requires innovations in terms of the electrical grid. It requires innovations in the semiconductor supply chain so that we can source from there, you know, without blowing the budget and things of that nature. So in terms of the future, who knows? But we do know, I think, with real confidence that those places that build like big things in this area and modernize these industries are going to be in a position to maintain leadership or obtain leadership in this technology.
That important comment about capital investment, right? That these are high-cost infrastructure development projects. I'm wondering, to both of the Bens, to Ben squared on this panel, if you could talk a little bit about this energy infrastructure question, right? This is an area where the kind of future is very open in terms of AI applications. The future of the technology stack down the line is quite open, what that's going to look like, geopolitical considerations, policy considerations, but also industry pickup. And I don't mean the AI industry, but all of the industries that might be customers of the AI industry. A lot of uncertainty in that space and a lot of opportunity. But there is this constraint on just energy infrastructure in the United States, but also globally. I kind of leave it to you who wants to take it first, but if you could talk a little bit about why do we have that challenge, what's happening there with that delta between what we kind of think the infrastructure should be able to provide and what it can do now. And then I would love you to comment, Ben, a little bit on the policy landscape to date and some of the kind of moving features of that to address that. And then you also to comment, Ben, on the kind of company side of this, right, which is very beholden to that infrastructure and how you navigate some of that on the inverse.
I'm happy to start at least on some of the why we have this challenge, that piece of the question, then maybe we can go back and forth. But you know, building these data centers and AI infrastructure broadly is extremely complex, and there's both technical reasons, many of which others have spoken to already, but also a lot of regulatory and economic reasons why this is being challenged. So I think to understand the scope of the problem, it's helpful to break down AI infrastructure into really 3 discrete types of infrastructure projects that are required to be built to operate one of these large-scale data centers. And this is the way that AI infrastructure is actually defined in the executive order that we put out in January of this year to advance development of AI infrastructure. So you have on the one hand, obviously, the actual data centers themselves where the chips are located. And that, again, is a very complex undertaking to build, but that's one part of the project. But then you also have 2 other things. You have the actual energy generation infrastructure that is used to provide power to the facilities, and then you have transmission facilities in some capacity. There's some nuance there, of course, if you're building your energy generation, quote unquote, behind the meter and kind of located on site with your data center. But generally speaking, you even in that case will typically want, for a variety of reasons, often to interconnect that infrastructure with the electric grid. So you have those 3 components, which are each very different types of construction projects in some ways. And there's, in turn, 3 types of regulatory barriers that make building these projects take so long, particularly in the United States. The first barrier is permitting, right? And here there's really 6 types of permits that you have to think about that apply to each one of the things that I just described. The data center, the transmission infrastructure, the generation. You have permits at the state, the federal, and the local levels of government. And you have environmental permits, and you have permits for land use or zoning, right? So it's a wide range of different things in those different categories. And of these categories, the state and local land use and zoning permits can often take years to sort through. They'll depend on where you're located, but that's a very significant obstacle. And on the federal side, when it applies, you have permitting requirements under the National Environmental Policy Act, which serve very important purposes for resource management and environmental protection, but often can take years to sort through as well when they do apply to a project. So that's just permits, but then you have to consider additional approvals that are required for transmission projects. And here's where, in this case, you have approvals by state public utility commissions, both in terms of actually allowing projects for transmission to proceed themselves, but then also on cost allocation processes, which can take many years to sort through as well. This is why transmission lines, particularly larger ones, often take 7 to 10 years to build from start to finish. Then the third set of things, if that wasn't enough for everyone, the third set of barriers to contend with are assuming that you do connect your power to the grid and transmit some power from offsite, you have to receive interconnection approvals, which are managed not by government per se, but by utilities and utility organizations. And these can take anywhere from 4 to 6 years oftentimes, depending on other dynamics with how many people are in the queue and other regional variations. So all these types of regulatory obstacles are challenging because they are site specific. Right? They're going to vary location by location. They involve a wide different range of government actors that you need to coordinate with and interface with if you're a developer to get through these processes. And you have to deal with all of them at once, right? It's not as though you can deal with 80% of them and then build your data center. In order to actually reach full capacity for your project, that timeline is going to take as long as the longest pole in the tent permitting-wise. So each of these things, you need a plan and an approach to deal with each of them. In addition to this, there's also a range of what I would describe as economic obstacles or challenges here, which, to some extent, money and being able to pay additional amounts of money for a project can solve or contribute to, but are real constraints, I think, where there's a role that's important for policy as well. So one is on the labor side. In this country in particular, there's a shortage of electrical workers, other types of engineers that are actually needed to construct some of these data centers and then grid and transmission infrastructure, particularly in places which might be otherwise suitable for AI training, which might be more remote or removed from large urban areas. And then on the input side, you have certain components for grid technologies, especially like transformers, circuit breakers, but also cooling racks, other things that go into the data center itself. There's domestic shortages and long lead times in these industries as well, which make planning for expansions of the grid, expansions of data center infrastructure, particularly difficult and challenging. So we can come back, maybe I'll let Ben weigh in too. We can come back in a minute to the things that government is or can be doing to address those challenges, but I think it's helpful to kind of break out why this is such a difficult problem in the United States in particular to build all this infrastructure.
I think we're seeing just in the room that this is turtles all the way down, right? These are technologies and industries underpinning other technologies and industries all the way down and trying to drive some of that cost. Can you give us a sense of what this is like from an OpenAI perspective, from sort of where you're sitting, a business that's not historically in the business of energy infrastructure per se, but is very beholden and sort of trying to navigate this delta in real time?
Yeah, I thought Ben gave a great synopsis of those challenges and appreciate your work on the EO that went out. And I don't think we would have really anything to add to those particular issues. He laid it out really well in terms of the permitting challenges. Let me add that's sort of like where government almost needs to get out of the way. So let me complement that by saying like where the government has a really important role to play proactively. When it comes to large infrastructure projects, it's almost never done by the private sector or the government exclusively. It really does require an active partnership. And this country has a history of actually doing that very well. Like the intercontinental railway system, right? The Erie canals, like the big, Depression era projects, the interstate highway system. Like we've actually been able to build like very large things as a country. But you sort of need the government to be actively involved in helping get that done. Because as I talked about before, part of it is like providing reassurance to capital that there's a return on those investments. and the government has a sort of a backstop role to play in that. Part of that is getting the permitting and approvals to like build the things. And we, given that history, we are also facing like a competitor that is doing that in a different way, right? So the Chinese Communist Party like is very good at large infrastructure. Doesn't always have a return on that infrastructure as demonstrated by like the empty cities that sometimes exist in parts of China, because they don't always get the market dynamics correct. But they know how to build like large things. And this is an area where like that's really critical to the competition, right? So how as a country do we compete with a system that is able to integrate like large amounts of both capital and power, and like sort of top down say like this shall be built, right? Like we're not that great at doing that. Like there's a bus stop near where I used to live in Silver Spring, Maryland, that took like 15 years to build. So, I'm just saying we need to figure out a way to get back to a little bit of like what we've been good at in the past. And that does require the government to sort of be actively involved in some of these areas.
Before we pivot back a little bit on the policy space, and then we'll turn to Eric. Ben, so one of the challenges on this delta between energy and infrastructure and what we need to power a lot of these applications is we don't have a really good measure of the delta. And there's some estimates out there that have been widely sort of criticized for not being particularly precise. There is data that sits inside firms sort of on their energy usage. Can you give us a sense of why we're having such trouble even knowing what that delta is and some paths forward on that?
Yeah, so part of this is just legitimately that the pace of the technology adoption is unprecedented in some areas. So it's just inherently difficult to predict the future. CSIS recently put out a report in which they talked about like GPU demand in the United States for data centers. It wasn't even AI data centers. I don't want to get the numbers complete. I think they were saying that like use last year was something like 89 million or 86 million, and their projection for 2030 was anywhere like in the range of like 160 million GPUs, which even if that is like way off, is still a colossal, just tremendous growth. And so given just the scale of those numbers, it's difficult to plan. I think that we are very blessed to live in a country where there's actually abundant energy. Like I work on a team that has been sort of traveling around the country looking at different sites for AI data center, where we're doing site selection work, and there's a lot of resources out there. It's not that we lack this. The energy exists. It's about figuring out how to down select on an area where it can be built quickly. It can investors are confident that like there's going to be a return profile there. You sort of have sight lines in terms of the transmission approvals and the interconnect queues and the legislative requirements for sort of behind the meter. There's not going to be objections to things like that. So I think the energy is there. And in terms of the distribution, I was on a panel last year in which I think it was somebody from Oak Ridge National Labs there, and they said, in the 50s, the labs used like a crazy percentage of the national energy consumption. I think it was like 30%. It was like one lab. So there is precedent for certain industries, like requiring tremendous energy, and I think there's legitimate questions about what does that mean for the environment and sustainability. The good side, though, is that when you have a strong commercial incentive for the energy grid to be more efficient, like money goes into that grid to improve it. It creates positive externalities for the community writ large, and there are benefits that can flow publicly in that environment as well. And we've done that again before, where pseudo-public infrastructure has been required for private needs, and it ends up being resulting in actions that improve that infrastructure for all Americans. And hopefully we'll see that in this instance as well.
I did want to have one comment, not because it's especially pertinent to NVIDIA, but just because I think it's interesting. There is an impression when you go and have conversations, with congressional staffers or other folks in the policy space, think tanks, this idea that this growth in baseload demand is incompatible with some kind of, let's say, happy energy future. An important note I would make in line with Ben's comments is it's really hard to deploy new technologies when demand is stagnant. It's a lot more possible to explore new and better technologies when demand is growing. And so we don't have to look at this march towards a baseload demand expansion as a bad thing. It can be an opportunity to drive better energy technology development. Actually, it's really hard for private industry to want to drive to better energy technology development when the argument to them is, oh, and by the way, we're also trying to make sure that you never get new customers. It's replace. We need you to replace the old energy technology. That's a much harder sell because there's no upside there. When the demand is growing, that's when there's the best opportunities to explore new technologies because new technologies are expensive to explore.
We're in this moment where sort of demand can drive innovation. Also, demand is sort of driving down cost, which increases some of the load, so a lot of sort of complexity in that space. Could you finish us out on this portion of the conversation with a reflection about where the United States sits vis-a-vis other countries, right? So Singapore, which is looking and investing more heavily in much more modular approaches, or France, which has kind of nuclear power in a very different architecture and scale than is available in the United States. What are some of the kind of differentiation we see between countries, as well as opportunities? We are at an international policy school, opportunities for countries to collaborate and learn from each other here.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that maybe I'll first just kind of comment on China in particular, which Ben already spoke to, but I think this is a great example of a country that has a very, very different set of regulatory and political dynamics around building giant infrastructure projects, right? You know, China in 2023 deployed, I think it was something like 300 gigawatts of clean power alone, and each year they're permitting additional nuclear capacity. They can permit nuclear plants in 4 to 5 years, is my understanding, if they move quickly enough, and that's substantially faster than these processes move here. You know, this is why China has deployed in recent years so much more clean energy than the United States has, where the comparable numbers in our country are much lower, unfortunately. So I think that there's definitely differences across countries and important ways that we can learn from what others are doing and potentially be in collaboration with each other. So, France, with nuclear technology, as you mentioned, right? I think that particularly in the slightly more medium to longer term, right, nuclear technology can be really promising for this set of infrastructure projects. Small modular reactors, in particular, are a place where a lot of folks are seeking to invest in bringing new capacity online, not necessarily later this decade, but by the 2030s or early 2030s, this could be possible. And there's certainly opportunities to, and I think other countries would be really interested in this, frankly, in learning from us in some capacity, but sharing knowledge and expertise, about building some of these emerging technologies and regulatory assistance in terms of how to ensure that we vet designs appropriately and can permit these and approve the designs of these technologies quickly. So these are all places where there are some ways that the U.S. has comparative expertise. Other countries like France have potentially more expertise in some areas too, and I think there's a lot can be done to kind of learn from each other's examples. One other thing I'll say in particular too that I think the U.S. is really well positioned to kind of share more on is on geothermal technology, right? So this is one of the energy sources that I personally am most excited about in terms of being able to, if I think the government provides appropriate support, in terms of permitting and helping be kind of a market maker and help capital flow to some of these emerging applications of geothermal technology. I think it could really be a part of the solution for AI's power needs in the later 2020 timeframe. But this is an area where the United States, in terms of the oil and gas sector, has a lot of expertise, frankly, in the underlying technology behind geothermal power, which involves drilling holes into the earth and accessing geothermal steam, through that mechanism. So that's somewhere where I think that we can provide in this country, we can play a real leadership role and work with other countries to, kind of take shared approaches to meeting AI energy demands globally and potentially using clean power as, really driving forward how we meet those challenges.
Fantastic. I'm going to have us pull back up to the AI triad. So this sort of algorithms, models, data, compute is these kind of three big components sitting on, obviously, a base, if we imagine that as a stool of talent, and the energy grids that you need to support that. And I'm going to shift our triad slightly over to you, Eric, and talk a lot about the compute stack. And I'm going to do that by sort of grounding on a company that's made a lot of news, was just discussed earlier this morning, DeepSeek, which created a lot of hype about how much compute and what types of compute do you actually need to maintain on the kind of leading edge of AI innovation and to kind of occupy both economic positions of power but also geostrategic positions of power. Can you give us a little bit of sense of how accurate some of that hype was? based on one particular paper and one final training round, but how accurate some of that hype is in that space, and what the kind of future of compute infrastructure, and I don't mean 10 years out, but in the sort of next 1 to 2 years, is compute still this really important choke point, this area where now if you don't have that infrastructure quite right, you're not going to be able to compensate off of things like data or algorithms.
So you hear DeepSeek described as a moment, the DeepSeek moment, sometimes compared to the Sputnik moment or similar technology surprises. I don't really think that professionals in the AI space found DeepSeek terribly surprising. As impressive as it is, and if anything is surprising, and I don't think this should be surprising, but if anything is surprising, maybe it's that it, in an open source fashion, came out of China before it came out of the United States. But even that maybe ought not be so surprising, because the United States isn't predominantly pursuing highly capable open source models. There are some of those, but that's not the paradigm that the U.S. is exploring at this very moment. And maybe Ben will have comments on OpenAI's thoughts on that. But firms are looking at it uniquely. So that's my sort of general comment. To dive more specifically into questions of the hardware and what the requirements are, if we rewind to when the first sets of large language models that really impressed the public, where those came from, right? So there's probably GPT-3 that came out and really captured the public's imagination. What do models like that require? So those are your foundational models that are built from very large amounts of data trained on, at the time, you would say very large compute clusters. We've now pushed forward the horizon for what we call a large compute cluster. But in that, 2019, 2018, what we would have called a very large cluster then. So these compute clusters, they take huge amounts of data and they train it into a foundational model. And what does that require? Well, it requires lots of data, mostly scraped off the internet, and it requires an enormous amount of compute all in one place, all working on one training task. If I look at what DeepSeek has done with, even before their reasoning model, just their earlier model, and then eventually their reasoning model, their framework for how they trained that was different, but I would expect it to be different because it represents an evolution in how I start to produce more functional or more economic models. And so I'll explain what I mean by that. Foundational models take a huge amount of data and a huge amount of chips, and they compress it into a model. Now I have models I can access through a variety of platforms, right, on websites, for example. I no longer need, if I want to train a smaller, more economic model for a specific set of applications or a pared down set of functionality, I no longer need to start from a starting point of a bunch of raw data from the internet. So I can start from access to models, maybe my own models, maybe other models, and I can have a more, what I would call, instead of a large cluster of the best possible chips, I have a, this is a fuzzy term, a medium cluster, whatever that might mean, a medium cluster of whatever chips I can manage to get a hold of. And I use that combined with access to other models, and I can actually cobble together a pretty functional, actually maybe even a more economic, smaller model. But it's important to note that the DeepSeek's reasoning models did not have the full set of functionality, the full set of capabilities of, for example, OpenAI's models, right? It was a pared down set of functionality. And so I should be expecting to see more and more of that as firms want to develop more specific models for more specific cases. They'll be smaller, they'll be more economic, but what they're also not doing is pushing forward the frontier of model capabilities. They're operating within known capabilities and then making a more economic model. When we look at what Elon Musk or Altman and company, what they want to do with these true frontier models is they're trying to push the frontier of capabilities. That's not what DeepSeek represents. And so I should expect to see more and more of this. I should expect to see additional specialization of medium models going inside of firms, financial institutions, healthcare institutions, as they develop in-house capability and in having fine-tunes on models that they maybe don't want to live out in the public, or maybe they'll have them in multi-tenant data center facilities. And so, for the evolution of AI, I should expect to see a drift away from only operating in pure foundational model mode, where I start to have a more diversity, greater diversity of models. And they're more economic, they're smaller, they're tuned for more specific applications. And in the DeepSeek sense, it was still really just kind of a reasoning chatbot, but I could envision additional data for protein folding or for market predictions or whatever that might be, starting to get integrated into these models as I go to a fine-tuning stage.
Before we push forward for questions, Ben, I'd love for you to weigh in on this difference as well, right? The types of compute that you require at a place like OpenAI, how that looks different sometimes from what we might see at a place like DeepSeek, but also just access to that computational power at the hardware as well as sort of the data center level, and the relationships you have with companies that provide a lot of that computing power.
Yeah, so I think this gets to an issue of scarcity and how growth happens or development. What I mean by that is what was just discussed in DeepSeek was a demonstration of how you could sort of do more with less than we had expected. But that doesn't mean you can't also do more with more. And when I'm, the stock market freaked out when DeepSeek came out, and I found the whole thing slightly surprising. At least because I thought if it was going to drop, it would have dropped for a different reason. And that is because in the history of microelectronics, never has the development or the demonstration that you could be more efficient with compute led to less interest in more advanced compute.
We're actually quite focused on continuing to make that the case.
Yeah, that has literally never been the case. It's never been, we can do more with this older chip, therefore we don't need newer chips. There is no precedent for that. So I think there's just a misunderstanding of how the industry sort of functions and development occurs. And that also relates a little bit to the energy issues that you talked about and scarcity. My first job actually after graduating from SAIS was at the Department of Energy. I was in their Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence looking at energy markets. And this was a period of peak oil. Well, everybody was freaking out that the world was running out of oil. And as it turned out, certainly sometime not long after that, we had an abundance of oil and the price crashed. Because what we learned is that when there's scarcity, it results in stimulating innovation and figuring out how to develop more resources. And that is sort of, I think, a general law of development. And it's going to occur in energy for AI as well as everything else here. And so we're sort of focused on how do we develop faster, how do we build the frontier, how do we develop these partnerships so that we maintain leadership. And it's hard to, as we said earlier, predict exactly how that's going to look. Who knows exactly what the energy composition is going to be of the country in 15, 20 years, right? Will we use fusion, right? Will we be doing thermal more? What happens with natural gas? It's very difficult to predict this. But as a general matter, we can know that there will be something new, and it probably will be a hell of a lot more efficient, and we'll be getting more out of less, right? So that's sort of a little bit of the way that I think about that question.
Fantastic. I want to open up to questions in the room. I think there'll be some microphones circulating for any questions in the room.
Okay. My name is Dr. Gonzalez. I am from the private sector. It has been my comment is quick. It's about what the speaker from NVIDIA and OpenAI have in touch. But essentially, what I'm hearing is that we just need a lot of data, chips, and energy, so everything goes down into infrastructure, and that infrastructure that needs to be built. Then we need more energy and all of the use of natural resources such as water that nobody mentions, but this is a natural resource that is needed to cool down all the processors in the big computer plants or whatever they call. But here's the thing. As you mentioned about DeepSeek. So China has already shown us that we can do less rather than more. And also, it's not either more perfect or less perfect than what we already have with different companies in terms of AI platforms. So why do not we learn about that and try to be less but more efficient? Because you mentioned not necessarily more is bad. But think about it, that you can do a lot of things very efficiently with less. So why keep building and building and building and more resources, energy and water and all these issues about regulations and permits and all that? When China already demonstrated that one, why don't take the models that already exist and try to build from those so we make it more efficient? And like you say, the speaker from NVIDIA, we should focus to every particular issue to create those models rather than make it a humongous model and try to do with that model everything. So my thinking is that I would like someone to comment about it.
So how do we manage some of these trade-offs?
Who wants to take that one?
I can go first. So look, I think it's a great question. I think that there's two purposes to these two things. So to these sort of all-in-one, very large all-in-one models versus starting to fragment and specialize, which is what DeepSeek represents an idea of doing. Building very, very large models is really about trying to achieve the next level of function of what AI can do versus starting to target much more specific applications that are more, I would call them sort of like frontier models versus functional models or economic models that are about efficiency. But let me take a step back, because even if I create more efficient models, that actually doesn't imply that energy use goes down. It actually could imply that energy use goes, and in fact, to borrow from the chips industry, chips are, I don't know, since the 70s, 10 million times more efficient. But how much energy did I use on compute in the 70s versus now? It's not even close, right? So efficiency is important, but we should not confuse ourselves to think that increasing efficiency de facto means I will use less energy. Actually, it could mean that it becomes so much more useful because efficiency is improved, that perhaps I use more energy. But the important way to think about it, or this is how I sort of think about it, efficiency is really important, because if we find AI to be useful, we are going to try to push our ability to access resources as much as we can. The efficiency of AI determines who gets to access that AI. So we're going to hit some ceiling based on our ability to stand up energy resources, based on our ability to do permitting, et cetera, et cetera. And if the AI is inefficient relative to some baseline, I'm going to have to pick winners and losers. And if the AI is more efficient, I'm going to be able to let more people use it. And so I can't say that increasing efficiency will bring down total energy use. I perhaps wouldn't expect it to. But what it will do is it will help democratize AI, because in an efficiency-constrained environment, I'm going to have to choose which firms get access to this. And in a system where the AI is more efficient, I can service a greater number of users for a greater number of applications. But I'm still going to be bound by those same infrastructure and energy ceilings, I guess, for lack of a better term.
So we'll I think take that on offline. I think it's a good conversation, but I did want to give Ben a chance, who is also, I think, name dropped in the question, to talk a little bit about this trade-off between sustainability, this iceberg I know Eric and I have talked about, where as you're lowering cost, more and more application becomes affordable in this space, so you may have actually increased energy. How do you think about that trade-off in real time, considering that there are some real sustainability challenges today?
Yeah, I think Eric's answer was excellent, really. I think,
Thank you very much.
I'm just, no, nothing is static, right? So you're either sort of improving and growing, or you're sort of falling. Like you almost never stay in the same place. And so what we've been talking about is like, how do we keep moving in the right direction in a competitive way? And there's risks in doing something new and being at the frontier for sure. But there's also a lot of history to suggest that there's a lot of benefits to that. And there are resources that are going to be used up, right? And we don't know the composition of like which resources and how much efficiency is going to come out of that development. But as a general matter, our view is that we really should try to stay ahead, and that it ultimately will be beneficial to, you know, the more people if there's more abundance of this technology.
So we have another question up front. I'm glad to see so many hands going up. We could do Q&A for the next 5 days and probably not exhaust the expertise on the panel. But Thomas, please.
Thank you. Question for Ben Schwartz. Thank you for your fascinating comments on the logistics aspects of building data centers. What are some of the non-obvious bottlenecks beyond cooling, beyond having the chips, beyond perhaps the permitting process? Maybe technologies that need innovation in order to actually run compute at that scale? What are the things we're not thinking about?
Well, I could just share, because you know our engineers would know more in terms of the technical requirements, but I could share what I'm told when I go and ask these guys, like, what are your bottlenecks? And I often hear two things. One is actually the permitting. That's the first thing. Is that when they think about like and they have these charts of like everything that needs to happen to get from here to an actual build site. And the biggest thing they note is the permitting. The second is the supply chain and the challenges in terms of getting equipment and getting components. So turbines and transformers and, you know, just efficient supply chains. And, you know, this stuff is scarce in some areas. And, you know, given the fluctuations in international trade that we're experiencing, there's even more uncertainty about how this is all going to go down. There's always technical improvements and new technology that we're interested in. Our hardware team spends a lot of time just meeting with new startups to sort of say, all right, like, what's the new thing that you're putting forward? Like, how could that improve efficiency and whatnot? But that's typically the answer that I get from the folks that I hear from.
Yeah, I want to double click on the supply chain one. I promise I'll go as fast as possible. The supply chain one is really challenging because there are obvious parts of the supply chain that we really hyper focus on. You know, an example would be like GPUs. We focus on where they come from. Famously, they come from an island called Taiwan. But when we think of the ingredients of a data center level infrastructure, you know, a rack with 72 GPUs also has about 1 million distinct components that are not GPUs. They are capacitors, resistors, passive components, mechanical components, fans. If I look at the energy infrastructure, transformer cores, some of the simple chips that run that, you know, turbine blades. These are all international supply chains, and not the GPUs, but most of the rest of what I said comes from China, and that cannot be ignored. I don't have an easy answer to that. If there's a startup that can fix that, I'm sure they'll raise a bunch of money.
Hi, yeah, I'm Cody, a reporter for The National. I have a question for you, Eric. Seeing as how NVIDIA hasn't been shy about its opposition to the chip export policy or the AI diffusion rule, I was wondering, do you ultimately think the Trump administration will reverse that, or has NVIDIA changed its stance on that?
Is it sarcasm? We haven't been that shy. We did a blog post. We usually say nothing.
Yeah, it's refreshing.
Yeah. You know, I don't have any special knowledge about how the administration is thinking about things. And I learn about these things often from the news. So, but I know that a lot of people last week who were thinking a lot about this topic are no longer with the administration. I don't know what to make of that. I understand that there's a comment period that's open right now that has a timer on it. So, you know, we're all thinking about that. But I have no other special knowledge, unfortunately. Yeah, yes, that's as it is written. Yes, that's how it would go. Yep.
Some additional questions in the room. One more.
Hi, Chris McCain, Northern Bay Foundation. Given that we have such an extraordinary panel of experts, I was wondering, could we suggest, do you have some ideas as to what could particularly leverage SAIS? Basically, SAIS is 70 nations, students, diplomats. I know, for example, Bloomberg since 2007 has connected about 45 cities in terms of future transportation, but I'm wondering how do we connect the future of AI, but to maximize the unique resource of having 70 graduate students across the nation.
The talent question and leveraging that talent. They're all just looking at me.
I'm happy to try to take us started. I mean, it's a really challenging question, right? And there's so many different types of talent that are integral to the well-functioning of all aspects of the AI value stack. That there's no one simple answer. But maybe I'll say a couple of things. So one, I think that continued investment in training in the United States, top AI scientists and people who are really skilled at the engineering aspects, computer science and otherwise is really vital to make sure that we are maintaining our stance at the cutting edge of innovation in the AI sector. So this is something that we in the last administration really tried to prioritize, in terms of investing in science and engineering training and education, and is something that I think is going to be really important for the United States to sustain its lead going forward. I think that more broadly, and I alluded to this a little bit in what I said previously as well, but I think there's a wide variety of technical trades as well that are going to be vital across actually building the physical infrastructure itself that is used to do AI training and operations. So not just computer scientists, but electricians, other electrical engineers or engineers who can be used to build the very complex data centers, which require a lot of it's a very difficult undertaking to build one of these things from a technical standpoint. Folks who can do the grid engineering tasks to bring that infrastructure online. And folks who are going to be innovating in the energy space. All of these things are going to be vital functions for maintaining our lead. And just as we want innovative AI engineers, we also want people who are innovating in the energy space, right? And who are helping build the next generation of nuclear or geothermal technologies, right? So I think that training folks in a wide range of tasks is really important and something that, again, requires further investment and where there's a lot of opportunity.
And I want to sort of take this opportunity as we close out to sort of foot stomp, I think, the flagship opportunities that JHU and the Emerging Technologies Initiative are doing in this space, which Mark, who is unable to make it today, who's at Whiting, so collaborating with Whiting, with computer scientists and material scientists, to the social scientists like myself, like Olga and Thomas that are sitting here in the front, and Ben, who you just heard from earlier, at all of these intersections. So very grounded in the technologies themselves, in export controls, in tariffs, in the energy infrastructure, in the legal permitting process, in what those sustainability demands look like, and being able to actually operate in those seams, which has been sort of echoed in the podcast earlier today, is where a lot of this action is happening across this space. So to flag, I think, a lot of the work there, and we would love to see that continue. And congratulations to both Olga and Thomas for really spearheading that at SAIS and beyond. So please join me in thanking our three fantastic panelists, and we hope to see you in the break with many more questions and conversations throughout. Thanks so much. Sure.
Thank everyone so much for coming. That was an incredible panel to start us off. A little bit logistics. We were happy to invite you to join us for lunch on the 8th floor from 12 to 1, and then we will get started promptly at 1 for our second panel on data and conflict. So please just come right before so we can get started on time. Thank you.